Welcome back to Student Hub Live. Well, this is our Refreshers orientation event, and so I asked some colleagues from across the university to think about some of the things that OU students might really need to know. And I'm joined by Sarah and Caroline from our law school here at the Open University, and we're going to talk about discussion and analysis. Now, you guys have a really exciting case here, and discussion and analysis can be quite a nebulous topic, I think, for students, but we've decided to illustrate this with a discussion about imitation firearms. So we've got some polls for you at home. Now, these aren't going to make sense because we're going to be using them in the session, but there's two questions. They're yes, no, or maybe, all right? So you get one option. Can fingers held like a gun be an imitation firearm? So we'd like you to have a think about that question, and we're going to draw on that in a second, and then we're going to maybe reset that later. Then we've got another question. Did the court make the right decision? Now, you're obviously not going to know anything about that or be able to vote on it until we talk about it. So just hold that one for now. But the first one, can fingers held like a gun be an imitation firearm? So we'd like to know what you think about that. Right. Let's first talk about skills of discussion and analysis. And why is this a good example of this whole important study skill?
Yeah, so when they are doing their degrees, students will be learning lots of skills and developing lots of skills. Discussion and analysis are really important. When we reach this higher level of study, we really have to be thinking about things from different angles and thinking about all different viewpoints and all of the different facts and backing it up with evidence and coming to a conclusion and realising sometimes that there isn't always a definite conclusion. So because Caroline and I are lawyers, we're going to be looking at a case, and as you've said, this issue of what is an imitation firearm, what can be an imitation firearm, but it's just as relevant to other areas of study. So really it's just to illustrate that rather than coming to an immediate conclusion, we need to think things through.
Now, one of the very common things that we do is we always start with defining our parameters or thinking about what it is that we're talking about. So we're going to have to do that because even in something like psychology or the social sciences, very often words can have a sort of colloquial or everyday meaning, but it's really important to get the specific context. So what do we mean then by imitation firearm? What's the definition?
Okay, so the offence is possession of an imitation firearm.
Okay.
And an imitation firearm is anything which has the appearance of a firearm. So what's a firearm?
Right.
You have to keep defining. So a firearm is a lethal barrelled weapon.
Right.
The obvious example is any kind of gun.
Yep.
So in other words, it's possessing something which looks like a gun.
Okay, so we're going to ask people at home then whether or not they think that a gun, fingers held like a gun, can be an imitation firearm. Let's see what they said. Oh, maybe. Oh, we're a bit on the fence. I reckon that's going to change. Okay, so we've heard then about the definition: a lethal barrelled weapon of any description from which any shot, bullet, or other missiles can be discharged. Okay. An interesting definition then compared to what people have said. What do you make of their answer?
I think maybe is a very sensible answer at this point. Part of thinking critically is not jumping to conclusions too early in the process. So well done to everyone who said maybe, really.
They're probably still looking at cats and cakes and things. Okay, so this whole discussion then is brought about by a case, and this is very common in law, isn't it? It's all about sort of, I guess, defining and really thinking about what these things are that we're talking about, and then thinking about precedents or things that have happened before. So we have a case, which is a common way of looking at things.
Exactly that. So we'll have a statutory definition, if we like, and that can be quite a narrow rule, but it has to be applied to a whole host of potential circumstances. So the case we're going to think about is Crown against Bentham.
Okay.
And in this case, back in 2002, we had a man who went into a former employer's house in the early hours of the morning, went to his bedroom where he was sleeping, had his fingers underneath his jacket, and says to his former employer, whilst he's just woken up, he's asleep, and he wakes up and he says, "I've got a gun," and he demands money, he demands jewellery, thinking it's a gun. The former employer gives him some money and he leaves with that money. And later on, the robber admits to friends or a third party that in actual fact it wasn't a firearm, it wasn't a gun, it was his fingers under his jacket pretending to be a gun.
Wow. So what happened?
And so, yes, well, I'll let you tell me, what was the question that arose for the court, Caroline?
Right, so he was found, the question came up, can you possess your own fingers? Because obviously the imitation gun was his fingers under his jacket.
Right.
So is it the case that you can possess your own fingers? Well, his lawyers obviously argued, no, you can't. The prosecution argued, oh, yes, you can. So,
And who won?
well,
We're going to come on to that later.
yeah.
But this is a very interesting thing because you can see how you're sort of starting with these definitions, and we've asked people at home what they think about it. But it's all about applying one thing to another thing. And I guess, I mean, it's very, very complicated. And in a legal sense, you're dealing with very tight sort of definitions and terms. But is this sort of how you'd start discussing and analysing things more generally, by starting and thinking, what is it we're talking about and how can it apply to this, this and this, and sort of trying to, I guess, wriggle around to see how much sense we can make of something?
Yeah, exactly. So on the one hand, we've got a party saying, yes, you can absolutely possess your fingers. On the other hand, if you look at it kind of objectively from the outside looking in, you say, well, actually, you know, if we were thinking about our possessions, if we were thinking about things we own, if we were making a list or an inventory, we wouldn't say, oh, yes, I own my house, my car, my arms, my legs, my fingers. You wouldn't think of possessions in that sort of a way. And so you could say, they're not possessions, your fingers aren't something you can possess.
But on the other hand, you might say, these are my fingers. I think of them as mine. If somebody said, whose fingers are they? Yeah. There's something that I'm claiming possession of.
Yes. Well, they're mine, whose are they?
Let's take a look at a picture we've got of one of your colleagues simulating this, because we couldn't get the real picture. So here we go.
Jim.
So this is Jim. But you can see how, you know, I mean, if this was in the middle of the night and you'd just woken up, you know, you can see how something like this might pose a threat. So let's reset the poll then and ask people at home what they might now think about having heard your definition and having heard some of these sorts of further information about it, as you say, whether or not they think that a gun can be an imitation firearm. Aisha, you all right there?
Yeah, we're laughing at poor Jim.
Let's just make it clear that he's not actually a robber or a gunman.
He's a very serious academic.
He is a very serious academic. And my daughter thought he was French. She said, what are you doing? Oh, it took a long time to explain. But he's very suave, I thought.
He is very suave. But Shirley has said under a coat it would be hard to tell. And you know, does that make a difference?
Okay.
And Victoria has said that she would rather that someone fake it and get a lighter sentence than get the same sentence for having the real thing. So we've got some good thinking going on here in the chat box. People are really engaged.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, let's see what they have to say now about that question. Can fingers held like a gun be an imitation firearm? So now we've had a big change. So 57% say yes, 29% say no. And whereas before we were in the majority with maybe, now it's only 14%.
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, we looked at that picture of Jim, and when we were taking the photo, it was surprising to me, actually, how difficult it is to make your fingers under a coat look like a firearm. We had to take a few photographs to try and make it, you know, feasible. So, you know, when we're thinking about something with the appearance of a gun, or a firearm, then, you know, can that really have the appearance of a firearm? How easy is it? And like you said before, do the circumstances matter? So, for instance, you know, if we've got someone who's just woken up from sleep, does that make a difference in terms of whether something could have the appearance of a firearm? So it's a very difficult one to call, isn't it?
Well, it is. And also, you know, one of the comments Michelle was saying, one of the students at home made, is about lighter sentences. I guess it's, you know, does it have to be categorical, or could it be, you know, an extent to which? I guess in law it's pretty much categorical though, isn't it? It's either you've got to argue something is or isn't.
Guilty or not guilty, yes. I mean, having said that, he was guilty of other offences regardless. He was guilty of the robbery, and it's a good point about the difference in sentences. You do get a lower sentence for an imitation firearm than a real one, which does seem fair.
So shall we break this down then and sort of revert back to the definition you gave us earlier, and then think maybe about the extent to which we can say that it is a firearm? Because you gave a very clear definition, and I mean, now that we know more and we sort of got into this whole idea, it should be fairly easy to sort of say, you know, yes or no, that can or cannot be seen as a firearm. And also we've raised various aspects here about, you know, the circumstances, how fearful the person was, you know, the fact that they knew them, etc. So going back to the definition then,
So the definition requires them to possess anything that has the appearance of a firearm. So we're back to this question. If you use your fingers, are your fingers a thing that you possess? And that is, as we saw, surprisingly tricky to answer. And that's very often the case. You have a lovely clear definition and you think that all makes sense. And then you try to apply it in these tricky cases. And it's not obvious at all. And there are different ways you can approach it. We've talked about some of the ideas around possessing. You can also say, do we look at the very narrow meaning of the words and work on that? Or do we take a slightly broader approach and say, well, what is this offence trying to stop? And it's trying to stop people pretending they have guns when they rob people.
No, absolutely. So it's this whole point of possession and the extent to which you can physically possess something that's part of your body or own something that perhaps is organic in nature. And there's the other aspect as well of all the circumstances around things. And I guess it's about taking all of these, this whole idea of discussion and analysis is taking it all into consideration, isn't it? So you'd mentioned some of the things here that were important in the circumstances.
Yes, so in terms of the circumstances, the court would have to look at all of those circumstances, but within the kind of the confines of that definition. So, like Caroline said, does this kind of are your fingers something you possess? And secondly, does this have the appearance of a firearm, using the definition of the firearm that we've given? And so the court inevitably will enter into all these discussions, and barristers will put forward each of these sides, and you'll have both conflicting sides of the argument. And that's why it's so important, really, that we develop these critical thinking and these skills of analysis within our degrees. And then we can see at the end, the court will weigh all these things up and they'll come to a conclusion. And the conclusion, you might think, well, okay, that's the conclusion they've reached, but there's certainly another side of the argument. And so even after you've weighed all these things up, you don't necessarily get a clear answer. But we have to come to a conclusion and the court has to make a decision.
So what did they decide?
Well, the House of Lords, which now the Supreme Court, the most senior court, decided that he was not guilty of possessing an imitation firearm because you don't possess your own fingers.
Right.
However, that wasn't an easy conclusion to reach. The Court of Appeal had found the opposite. They thought that he was guilty, and the original trial had thought that he was guilty because he did possess a thing that looked like a firearm when he put his fingers under his jacket. So got a final answer.
We
but
need to ask people at home then whether they thought the court made the right decision. So do you think the court made the right decision? Yes, no, or maybe? We'll come back to that in just a second. So before we think about whether or not they made the right decision, there's lots of stuff here, interesting as the case is, that we've sort of highlighted. So can we pull together some of the key aspects that you think would be useful for students in terms of this whole premise of discussion and analysis, which we started the conversation on?
Yes, exactly that. So when we are looking at our studies, and like we said, we've looked at law today, but it might be another discipline that you're studying. But the idea is just to kind of take a concept and really play with that concept, not just think, okay, there's the definition, that's what it is, but taking into account circumstances, thinking around the topic, looking at different evidence and different viewpoints. So you might look at different authors, different academics. In law, we'd look at what different judges have said. And then at the end, you can draw them all together and you can say, okay, here are the arguments. This is arguments on one side. This is another viewpoint. This is another viewpoint. This is why I think this is the kind of the strongest argument, the strongest evidence supporting my overall conclusion. And then negate the other points of view. So say, this is why mine is better than that argument.
So while we're asking people at home what they think, and we're going to come to their answer in just one second, what you're saying here is that when you're creating an academic argument, it's about saying, he said this based on this, she said this based on this. It's about being very objective and weighing things up and not just going with your gut opinion about how you're reacting to something. So that's the key sort of shift, I guess, from a personal opinion to something that's more of an academic way of presenting a case.
Yeah, exactly that. And then students will often say to me, well, actually, all I've done is put forward other people's views on things. But that's very important because you're giving academic weight to what you're saying. You're really backing up with evidence and with academic opinion.
No, that's been fantastic. Well, let's see what the verdict is at home. So did the court make the right decision? 67, percent say yes, they did make the right decision. 22% said maybe, and only 11% said no. So very interesting. And you're talking about various aspects of crime very, very briefly, because we're out of time, and I'm very keen for our next session for obvious reasons. How's everyone? What?
We'll try not to be
loads
offended,
of
Karen.
cake. I've got loads of cake. I'm ravenous. Sorry. No, this is really interesting. How's everyone at home, HJ and Michelle?
Well, I'm still a bit stuck on this. I still can't decide myself what I think. But there's a lot of interesting points about intent and the context of what's happening, because you can see children in the playground playing with fake guns and toy guns and things like that. And that wouldn't be the same as an adult doing that in a dark alley, perhaps. But it is all really interesting. I can see like all the different sides, and it has definitely got us thinking.
And Tala says the final answer is don't put your fingers in your jacket and pretend that they're a gun.
And also people talking about whether it could be a different crime, something like theft with menace, or, various other ways of interpreting things. So, but very interesting skills being shown here. So everyone will be fine, I think, in their degrees with this nice objective approach to discussing and analysing information in a way that may seem clear at the start, but has lots of implications as we're going through. Thank you both so much for coming along for that session. That's been really, really interesting, and a fun way to showcase some of the wonderful talent in the law school. So we're going to have a short break now. We're going to show you some videos from the Open University Graduate School, who are also going to be on for our next session, where they're going to showcase some of their cakes when our Bake Your Research section. So we'll be back in just a few minutes after this short video.